Welcome to the State of the Nation. Well. It turns out that the Democratic Alliance does have an economic policy, and today we're going to hear all about it. You wouldn't know that if you followed their campaigning. You wouldn't know that if you followed their performance in the government of national unity, but they do have economic policy, which sort of makes sense because a lot of the sale of the GNU was that here's the market-friendly Democratic Alliance that's going to be working with the market-unfriendly ANC. Well, it turns out that the DA does have some market-friendly economic policies, and to discuss it with me today is the DA spokesman for trade, industry and competition, and that is Toby Chance. Toby, welcome to the State of the Nation. Good to have you here.
Thank you very much, Mike. Nice to be here.
And yeah, I cornered you at an event where I said, we sure as hell know the economic policies of the EFF. We sure as hell know the policies, we won't call them economic, of the MK party. And we've felt the economic policies of the ANC. But for starters, why is the DA so reticent in divulging their economic policy or sharing it? Why are they so quiet about it?
Well, first of all, I have to question that assumption, Mike. I mean, I'm looking at a screen in front of me, which shows John Steenhuisen and his economics team launching the policy. I think it was in March or April last year in our head office in Bruma. And there was a significant journalistic contingent there. The policy was put onto our website. It was we described it in detail. We put it out into the media, and we've done everything we can to make people aware that it's there and it exists, and but, the contents thereof. But
surely in a country with sort of the economic situation that we find ourselves in, criminal unemployment, no growth, none of the other parties selling an economic policy that could even promise growth, why wouldn't this be front and center of your campaigning?
Well, I think it is, actually. I mean, if you think about the campaign in leading up to the May election, I mean, jobs and economic growth was the two most important components of our campaign. And I think it's evident that all of our spokespeople were saying that we cannot achieve the sort of broader social aims as a political party without having an economy that is functioning. And frankly, an economy that's only growing at less than 1% is never going to achieve those broader social aims. So I'm very pleased to be here and hopefully to be answering some of the questions from yourself.
Yeah, and let's hope that people get out there and actually know that there's economic policies, because one would imagine the next step to having wonderful economic policy, now that you are in government, is to somehow see that economic policy see the light of day.
Yes, and we do have ministers and deputy ministers, and so certain areas we have more control over than others. Obviously, there's the issue of collective decision-making in the cabinet, which the DA has to respect. Not that it's necessarily been abided by members of the ANC government and other ministers, but we have to do our best to change the culture of one-party state rule, which we've had over the last 30 years.
Yeah. Now, and we can. It's a great document. I've gone through it. I've had a look at it, and it's common sense. It's a lot of what we would expect out of a party that positions itself like the DA. Very, it's relatively pro-business, I would say, not very pro-business. There's still talks about a lot of regulation and government doing this and government doing that, which always terrifies the hell out of me. But there were some things that are worth, that are definitely worth highlighting. You talk about launching a startup nation. That's obviously a term which a lot of countries have used to great success. Let's talk about doing business in South Africa.
Yeah.
South Africa has had 80 years of successive nationalist governments that hate small business. My theory on that is that nationalist governments, by their definition, hate voters that have agency. So they'd rather deny people the right to make their own decisions, keep them dependent on the state. You talk about launching the startup nation, removing import duties on certain things that would help small business, Bucky's. I like that one.
Yes.
You might cause a run on Bucky's if that were to be passed, One-stop shop, which is kind of the thing that every country that has chased business growth has done.
Right.
Rwanda, Southeast Asia. You literally decide to start a business, you go to one place and you walk out an hour later with everything that you need and your business is going.
Yeah, I think where we need to start, you made the point that we've had 80 years of national government in this country. And the thing about national government is that they tend to be very inwardly focused. They tend to be aiming at self-sufficiency as much as anything else. And that's why the National Party was doing its best to build up heavy industries and industries that could supply basic goods to this country. And the ANC is now, for the last couple of years, been pushing the localization policy and import substitution as a way of industrializing. But I want to take you back to a book which I referenced in my budget speech that I gave in July in Parliament, which was the book by Mcebisi Jonas, the former Deputy Finance Minister, whose reputation was significantly enhanced when he turned down a R500,000 bribe from the Guptas to become the R500 million, to become the Finance Minister. And in his book, After Dawn, which he published in 2019, shortly after President Ramaphosa was sworn in as president, he pointed out the four main groupings behind the settlement of the 1990s, and this set the tone for economic policy in the next 3 decades. And those four groupings were established white business, white capital. They were the black elite. They were the unemployed and the marginalized, and there were the workers. And each of those had their representatives at the negotiating table. But the one body or the one community or grouping that was missing from that was the entrepreneurial class. In other words, the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of small independent businesses, mostly family-owned, that were struggling to make a living and were finding it difficult to break into new markets, were dealing with huge amounts of regulations, which have only got worse ever since then. And one of the first pieces of legislation that was passed by the new government was the 1995 Labour Relations Act, the provisions of which were essentially imported from Europe and developed countries. And the then minister, Tito Mboweni, made no bones of the fact, as a former trade unionist, that the workers were going to be given much more prominence in legislation, rightly so, but to the detriment of flexibility in the labour market. So what has happened is that since then, government, big business and unions have stitched things up to the point where they can raise wages without it really hurting their competitiveness. They just put up prices. Yes, so the Labour Relations Act was used by the unions and government and business to regulate, obviously, labour on the shop floor, and it has resulted in smaller businesses being prejudiced. So one of the provisions was the setting up of bargaining councils in sectors, and the minister is able to extend the agreement that is reached in a bargaining council to all businesses in that sector, even though they may not have signed up to the agreement. And that, of course, means that smaller businesses have no choice but to accept the terms of whether it be wages or conditions or whatever sort. And we have been pushing against this for many years, and so has many other business groupings, in the interest of small business. And I think, everybody talks about the small businesses being the backbone of the economy, but ultimately, without support for small business, they are just going to suffer.
Yeah, I'm always perturbed by this, because I've run small businesses most of my life, and if I can become spokesman for small businesses, please don't worry about us. Just get out of our way.
Yes.
We don't want support.
Exactly.
We just don't want you in our
way.
Yes,
that's true of certain businesses. I mean, particularly businesses that have been around for ages. But
no, I'm talking about any business. I mean, which business? What kind? I'm saying you can only get in the way.
Well,
really.
that is true. But I just reiterate the point that there are many aspirant businesses, particularly black-owned businesses, that want to be started. The entrepreneurs want to get the business off the ground, and they're continually asking for support. They're asking for business to be left alone, yes, but they're also looking for support. Part of what I have to do now is to look at what are the elements of support that are worthwhile getting involved in, and what parts should government be doing and what parts shouldn't they be doing.
Yeah, I think there's a separate discussion to be had on the perversion of what is small business and what people are asking for. So we now have the situation where the government's economic policy, business policy, if one could call it that, has been completely captured by big corporates in South Africa. They write their own legislation when they support the government. So they'll do what they did last year with their work groups, rescue the government. They can't wait for a crisis that they can rescue the government, and then they get to write their legislation and included in there some real doozies like FICA and RICA and God knows what else, and that's just designed to keep everybody out, isn't it?
I think there's a tremendous amount of overregulation, and much of it is being put together by the likes of BUSA and BLSA and the other business groupings. And one of the issues that is really a hot topic at the moment is that of BEE. And essentially business was brought into the picture willingly by government.
I'd say it's the other way around. Business brought government in.
Well, I think it's a bit of both. I think business wanted to be left alone as far as possible. They thought they were going to be left alone, but they weren't. By handing over, cushy board positions and handing over shares to
senior ANC members.
Exactly, to ANC cadres. And as a result of that, we've had a very concentrated economy, further concentrated in the creation of a very small black elite. And that has not helped the economy at all, because it reduces competitiveness, it just entrenches vested interests, and it doesn't allow the opening up of new markets and competitive industries, which innovation and entrepreneurship tends to be driven through the small business segment.
But help is at hand. The DA's in the government.
Well, yes. I mean,
so now you can get all of this stuff done.
Well, yes, we hope so. But why was it why did the DA not get the key economic ministries? We got deputy ministers of small business development, trade, industry and competition, and finance. And there's no doubt that our deputies are doing their absolute best. And in fact, I would single out Ashur Sarapin as the Deputy Minister of Finance, who had a significant impact on the medium-term budget policy statement that came out at the end of last year in restricting government's spending habits, pointing out the fact that we are highly indebted as a nation, and if we don't cut on our spending, we're going to hit the 80% debt levels. And of course, part of the problem is we're paying very, very high interest rates because of our country risk. The fact that we've been blacklisted or grey-listed by the Financial Industry Task Force. So what the DA is doing initially is just to sort of put the brakes on a little bit. What we now have to do is to start to bring the ANC and our partners in the GNU around to a new way of thinking around economic policy, driving growth, as our policy says, unleashing enterprise and creating jobs.
Don't you think that the ANC is going to head you off at the pass in a very easy way? They're going to say, well, we've tried this capitalism gig for the last 30 years and it doesn't work. So everything you're saying is just not, we've tried it and it failed.
Well, funnily enough, they haven't been trying capitalism.
We know that. But they think it, and their voters will think
well, yeah, you see there, it depends on which faction you're talking about, because the RET faction called it neoliberalism. And essentially supporting the white monopoly interests, whereas the ANC, who are forming policy, or not all of them, more realistic about the fact that we want to pursue policies which have shown growth and development and job creation in countries around the world that have pursued those policies. So there is going to be a big fight. It's coming.
When?
Well, it's happening now, because the cabinet is now working out the medium-term strategic framework, and that's going to be announced probably in the State of the Nation address on the 6th of February. And that will give us an indication of whether the cabinet has been able to think differently about economic growth and doing the things that we've said needed to be done to raise the growth rate from niggly 1% to 3 or 4%, which is where we need to be.
Now you sit there in the tent with the rest of them, literally in the tent. Yeah. Well,
pissing out rather than pissing in.
Yeah. And you get to see those cabinet ministers in the eye. What are the chances that any of them will be interested in anything you have to say? You've given them untrammeled power.
No, I wouldn't say untrammeled power. I think they're beginning to realize that they don't have that untrammeled power. And the alternative of, collapsing the GNU and going into a minority government or into bed with the other parties on the left are more and more unattractive. So I think it's a learning curve. And one of the interesting things that we've learned from the GNU is that much of it is to do with building relationships between the individuals sitting around the cabinet table. And, although as the DA we've been pointing fingers and we've been, vilifying our opponents, actually when you're in government, you have to start to build relationships. And that's become very important. And listening to our colleagues who are in government, finding a surprising amount of common ground and willingness to work together. And that's what you find when you actually are answering tough questions from a population that is getting sick and tired of years and years of underdevelopment.
Yeah, so far that building relationships seems to me to incorporate a lot of Vaseline buying on what I've seen, because I'm yet to see anything. But hey, let's not be too negative. I see that one of your points, we talk about the startup nation, which is great. I'm all for it, and anything I can do to help, I'm available. Your second point is saving and spending better, right? And immediately I say that I've heard the deafening silence on the bloated cabinet. And I've heard the deafening silence on blue lights and multiple cars and all the other perks that go with bloated cabinet.
Well, on the cabinet, I agree with you. It's bloated. It's way too bloated. And part of the reason for that, I'm not justifying it, but this is the reason, is that when you have a GNU of 10 parties, you've got to dish out the positions. So you've got to. I mean, that was the decision that was made by President Ramaphosa.
Well, you agreed to it. Please, let's not put everything at his door.
No, of course, we did agree to it. But, ultimately, you've got to make a call as a party. What are the things that are worth fighting over and what are not? And we can get to that in a minute. I think that it's a bit stale, actually, the blue light story, to be honest, Mike, because that has been dealt with very adequately by John when he was criticized about it. The fact is that all of our ministers inherited the vehicles. They have not bought a single vehicle. They do not switch on their lights. They do not have a convoy of cars charging down the highway at breakneck speed. And that has been shown to be the case. But I do want to point out something which is important to state, and that is that some of our ministers, and I won't name names, have received threats to their personal security, and that is why they do have a security detail. And people are vulnerable. People who are making unpopular decisions, and let's face it, these decisions are against vested interests, criminal syndicates, criminal interests that do not want the state to regain control of critical areas of our economy. And those cabinet ministers and deputy ministers need to protect themselves. They need to be protected. Now, it doesn't mean to say they should have blue lights, but it does mean to say that they should be looked after. They should have security details. They should have somewhere to stay, safe to stay at night. They should have protection for their families. And the DA supports that wholeheartedly. So
bloated cabinets here to stay?
I wouldn't say to stay. Certainly for the next 2 or 3 years, I would think, to keep the peace, to keep the GNU parties on board. I would think it would be unlikely that the president would reduce it by 20 to 30%, because that, who's he going to give the positions to? So there is a certain amount of pork bellying about this.
Okay, so let's marry point 1 and point 2. There's a Ministry of Small Business.
Yeah.
Which sort of speaks to your first point of startup nation, and your second point, saving and spending better. Here we've got a department that's euphemistically called the Ministry of Small Business that seems to do absolutely nothing to aid small business. Why not just rally around the closing of at least that department?
When it was formed in 2014, the DA didn't approve it. We believed that it should be...
You weren't the government then?
No, we weren't, but we still don't think that it's a viable department. If the government were to be rationalized, that would definitely be one of the departments that would be folded into a broader economics ministry, which could include other ones, not just the current DTIC. So, to separate small business out as a sector is incorrect, because small businesses operate in all the different sectors of the economy. They have to be brought in as role players in all the major decisions regarding small business. But yes, it has been largely ineffective. I must say that two of the initiatives as part of the Small Enterprise Amendment Act that was signed into law last year by the President, I had a hand in, because your viewers may not know that I was a member of Parliament between 2014 and 2019, and I was the DA Shadow Minister for Small Business Development. And I proposed the merger of the two agencies of the department, or two of the agencies, the CEFA and CEDA, which is Small Enterprise Development Agency and the Small Enterprise Finance Agency, into one, so that financial support and non-financial support could be combined. And then the other thing was, I tabled a private members bill in 2018 to form a small enterprise ombuds service to resolve disputes outside of the courts, because the courts, as you know, are very lengthy, time-consuming, and costly. And I'm happy to say that both of those provisions are now in law. So whilst the department is pretty ineffectual, has a very small budget of about 2 million rand, it has to be a function somewhere in government. Just where it sits is the issue.
Okay, well, good luck with that one. It'd be nice to see him do something, but...
Well, if I can just point out one other thing. A couple of weeks ago, I was on a tour of some of the Soweto industrial parks that are the responsibility of the department. I was with Deputy Minister Jane Sitoli, who's Deputy Minister of Small Business Development. And she came out very strongly on the issue of neglect of these industrial parks for the last 20 or 30 years under successive ANC governments. And I think that there's a very high likelihood that under her leadership as the Deputy Minister, you're going to see a massive change in that policy. There are over 100 industrial parks across the country. And I think by the end of this government's term, the 7th Parliament, you're going to see a huge injection of energy into that sector, so that the townships themselves can start to become engines of economic growth rather than just sort of recipients of grants and largesse.
Okay, you mentioned one of your pillars is to stop the interference with the Reserve Bank. We know that that's not really aimed at your alliance partners. They have been protectors of the Reserve Bank. That's meant for the people that aren't in the GNU, I'd imagine, because they're the ones that always...
Well, yes and no. I mean, if you think about it, there was a resolution at the ANC Congress in 2017 to nationalize the Reserve Bank. It's just that the government has not done anything about it. So they've just turned a blind eye to that resolution, as they have to several others.
Yeah. So keep it on there, but let's get into some of the more meaty points.
Yeah.
Getting South Africans working, and you have mentioned there minimum wage and non-racialism.
Yes.
Which obviously, that'll be a real hit at the end of the year party, I'd imagine.
Well, on the issue of the minimum wage, we, when it was introduced, believed that there should be sectoral determinations, and we believe that the minimum wage is actually a disincentive to
Well, the minimum wage is naught, isn't it?
Well, yes, it is. I mean, obviously, in terms of basic economics, it is. Of course it is. But if you look at minimum wages around the world, we are much higher as a minimum wage than most median wages across most economies. So it's set too high. And number two, in our recent policy, we said that the minimum wage should be fixed, so that as inflation eats into the value of money, the minimum wage eventually comes down. But to abolish it straight away would be probably slightly problematic in terms of the people that are now dependent upon that wage. On the non-racialism, it's a very fundamental part of our philosophy as the DA. Non-racialism is often misunderstood. People think that we don't recognize race. Of course we recognize race. It's a fact of life. But what we're saying is that we mustn't base policy on racial classifications, which are divisive. They bear no relation to the individual characteristics that people of different races have, and that we believe that individual characteristics and measures of need should be the determinant of support and government policies that are looking to equalize opportunities for people in this country.
Yeah, because surely I've often said that from an economic point of view, the race argument is pretty crazy, because if you look at it from the other side, by all measures, white South Africans have full employment. So therefore, to have racial classifications, if your intention is to hobble that side of the population, it's not really working.
Yes, I mean, I've just come from a meeting with a prominent member of the black business community who's been in this game for many years. And the purpose of the meeting actually was to talk about my my op-ed that I wrote in yesterday's Business Day and the position I've taken on the Transformation Fund, which we can discuss in detail a bit later. But the point I'm making is that we've got to get across this idea that there's black business and there's white business. You know, there is business. And our policies achieve that if we have a chance to implement them. But unfortunately, the race-based measures that are in place and have been put in place over 20, 30 years, most notably in BE and also procurement policy and now employment equity, have made it very, very difficult for the ANC to roll back that position without, losing face.
Yeah. I had occasion recently to do some work at one of our large banks, and you go into their big campus, which is massive, and they've got thousands of people working there, and it's predominantly black. But I presume by the obsession of classification, that would be classified as a white business. But certainly, the numbers don't bear it out. But yet, there's a classification because that's where its roots lay. That CEO is not white. Most of the senior members of staff aren't white, etc. But yet, you would still have Malema et al., carrying on about white business.
Yes, and unfortunately what people miss is that most of our businesses, particularly the listed companies, are owned by the pension funds. They're owned by the financial markets. They're not owned by individuals. They're owned by institutions. And now, many of those institutions are themselves run by black executives and represent pension funds that are representing black workers.
Yep, absolutely. So some more education needed, special economic zones. Now, this is one of those other things which gets trotted out all the time. Does it ever work?
It can work. It has worked in countries around the world. I mean, obviously in China, which was the first country to really punt these in a big way. And what they did was to identify coastal cities which could become zones of export excellence and manufacturing exports. Mauritius was a very good case in point, where they decided that they were going to penetrate the European market for sugar. So they set up a massive special economic zone for sugar. Countries across Africa are starting to look at these zones in Rwanda, in Kenya, Nigeria. South Africa hasn't been so great. Part of the reason for that is that our policy isn't really focused enough. We've got zones all over the country. Each province wants its own zone. So on Sunday and Monday and Tuesday, I spent some time in Limpopo at the Messina Mikado Economic Zone, which is yet to really get off the ground. But I mean, that's based on policies which were set in motion in the 2000s to mine coal and make more steel. Now, in the current environment, I can't think of two, less suitable industries to be punting, mining more coal and making more steel. Back in the Department of Trade and Industry, I think there's going to be some head scratching going on.
Yeah, well, that talks to South Africa's obsession with having ministers of trade and industry that hated trade and hated industry. We just got rid of Ibrahim Patel, thank God. We had Rob Davies, all these guys that are committed communists, and they literally hate trade and industry.
Well, I think it's partly that. I think it's also partly that they just come from another world. I mean, Patel was obviously a unionist. He came from the textile union. Davis was just was a communist economist who was brought up in a different way of thinking. Alec Irwin before him was a trade unionist, and so, as you say, they're not about wealth creation. They don't understand wealth creation. They don't understand how to run a business. I think to say they hate it, in some respects, maybe. I think they want to get at business. They want business to pay up. So I mean, if you look at the transactions in which Patel had a say, whether it be Heineken and Distell, or whether it be Massmart and Walmart, or even Grand Parade Investments. I mean, the crazy thing of Grand Parade Investments, you remember?
Yes.
I think they were in Burger King.
Yeah.
You know, they did a transaction and then they weren't allowed to sell their shares because the buyers didn't have the black empowerment credentials.
Yes.
Doesn't make sense.
Yeah. And we saw Ibrahim Patel at his best during COVID, where he was telling us what to buy, what to wear.
Precisely.
While we're on that kind of subject, you talk about creating growth, not oligopolies, which is basically to stop these master plans.
Yeah, master plans are, again, well, they actually date back to the Rob Davis era. The first master plan was the automotive master plan. The industrial policy action plan was a sort of grand master plan for South African industry. And now what's happened is, under Patel, is that many of the sectors have got together to create these master plans. But normally it's the bigger players, the players that, you know, that want to control things. And I think that talk about competitiveness and maintaining competition, they don't do that at all. You know, they're becoming cartels in a way, where they make up the rules that suit themselves rather than allow new entrants to come in and compete and innovate.
Yeah.
So we're very much against the master plan concept. I had an interesting meeting yesterday with some people involved in the cannabis master plan, which actually was developed by the Department of Agriculture.
Please tell me they were smoking something.
It looked like they had been heavily, but the fact is that master plan has been handed over to the DTIC, and there's an argument that is being made that a master plan is not suited to an infant industry, and cannabis and hemp is very much an infant industry. Does a master plan suit that? Probably not. So again, this is an issue which the DA is going to be taking up within the DTIC, you know, questioning the whole validity of the master plan idea.
But just when I was going through the economic policy and came across this, I'm thinking we are being hit with the super duper master plan.
Which is?
And that is your Minister Parks Tau coming out with a BEE fund, which is the master plan to end all master plans.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't think that he called it a master plan, but it's called the Transformation Fund, which does sit within the BEE Codes of Good Practice. And yeah, it came as a big shock to not just me, but also to business across the spectrum. And I think it was just cooked up, really, without really proper consultation.
But politically, it's a wonderful weapon because it makes the DA look absolutely stupid. Because
right, I'm not so sure about that.
No, you do, because if you say, you can't say yes, so you make it outlandish, crazy, 100 billion rand we're going to charge, we're going to another tax on business. And if you say this is a really bad idea, you look like white racists.
Well, actually, if you look at the commentary from not just journalists, but also business, I mean, if you look at the comments under the multitude of articles and pieces of writing on this in the last few days, it's remarkable how colorblind the comments are. And if you're a black business, chances are you haven't been a beneficiary of BEE. So you're going to say, well, thanks a lot. I'm not going to get any of that. It's only the connected comrades that are going to get that. So there's a general recognition that state money has been abused, and it's going to the connected few, and nothing's going to change. It's just that the quantum of money that's going to be used is much bigger. So, you know, I mentioned the meeting I just had with a representative of black business. What we actually have to do is we have to sit around the table as government and business and various other stakeholders and say, well, what comes after BEE? Because BEE has, it's had its day. It's really been in the game for far too long, and it's failed. So what are the new measures of transformation? And we believe in transformation as the DA. We believe that more of the economy needs to get into the hands of small business, and particularly black business. What are the mechanisms that we're going to put in place to achieve that?
I'm terrified when I hear you say that. I'm terrified because this is a thing that has got South Africa into the mess we've got, and that is government and business sitting around the table. Because it's highly unlikely.
Every country does that.
But what I'm saying is that who is business? You started off by saying way back in the early days there was the meeting of these four parties, but yet no small business was represented. You're talking about business, and I know that you're going to be talking about business.
No, we're not.
South Africa, right?
That's not the case. And I promise you, if I'm in the room, I represent small business and have done for many, many years. I've been a small businessman. I was the Shadow Minister of Small Business. People who see me on this program associate me with small business. And so absolutely not. That will not happen. under our watch as the GNU members, and it's going to be vitally important that the interests of small businesses of whatever hue are taken account of in whatever new regime is put into place.
Is this yet another red line? Or you must be running out of red tape.
The funny thing is about red lines is that, talk about the Bella Bill and the NHI, those were both pieces of legislation that were in place and were signed into law before the GNU was formed. When we talk about red lines in the future, we're going to have much more say over what is policy implementation look like. And what laws are being put into place. So I'm not going to say what's a red line and what isn't. But in terms of the transformation fund, which is just an idea at this point, we have a lot more opportunity to influence what that thing looks like, even if it exists at all, than we did before, because we were never in government when that legislation was passed.
But if the ANC respected you at all, it wouldn't have got to the stage, surely.
I think that's true. And I think that the pushback that has happened in the last week has shown Minister Tao that he can't just, unilaterally announce a thing like this. And my statement made it very clear that anything like that starts with having to raise new tax has got to be given a proper airing in cabinet and amongst the coalition partners.
Yeah, good luck with that. I think you better go and find out how you put up an iron dome, because they're going to come from every ministry.
No, they are. They're going to come at us, but that's fine. We're ready.
Yeah, so, maybe perhaps somebody should show a bit of leadership in the DA so that they do take you
here we are.
With a bit more respect.
We're the leaders.
Let's hope. You're looking at enhancing South Africa's global competitiveness. Now, to a lot of people, obviously, we can't grow this economy by selling more to poor people because they don't have the money.
Absolutely right.
We've killed off our mining industry, thanks to Gwedi Mantashe. We've deindustrialized. We have completely ruined our infrastructure for export. So therefore things like agriculture can't be exported. I do understand that the DA, you're not the governing party by yourselves, but is it even worth wasting the ink to say, let's enhance South Africa's global competitiveness?
Well, I don't think so, because if we don't do that, we're dead. We can't survive as an economy. We are a trading economy. More than half of our GDP is imports and exports. The thing is that we've got to change our mix of imports and exports. We've got to export more value-added goods, which doesn't necessarily mean beneficiation. We can come back to that. But it also means that we mustn't be pretending that we can make everything ourselves. And so we must be an open economy where we need to import goods that are necessary to then be manufactured into, value-added goods to be sold back to the rich economies. So I must pay tribute to what has happened in Operation Vulindlela. It's an initiative of the presidency and the Treasury to start to recoup some of the bad decisions particularly around logistics. Obviously our ports and our rails are a disaster.
Yeah.
The network industry is obviously including telecommunications.
But that seems to have stalled now.
It's just taking longer. It's taking longer than it should have. And I think that part of the problem is that Transnet in particular hasn't really got on board the need to concede operating licenses that are cost effective to private operators. That's the big issue. And also the court case that's happened around the Durban port is holding things up. So that it needs to be speeded up. But there has been progress at Eskom. Nobody can deny that. And I think what Ntata Teto has done in Eskom is commendable. And that starts with putting the right people in the right jobs.
Yeah, I've been fortunate enough to have him here. But this port deal that's being contested, is this just incompetence or is it corruption? Because it looks corrupt, if you ask me. They definitely weren't the best providers at the best price.
Well, the contention from Maersk is that the winning bid, the Philippine company, was improperly appointed because they were using their market capitalization to define or to contribute to their liquidity ratio, which is a very unorthodox way of defining a liquidity ratio. So whether it's corrupt, I can't say it's corrupt. I think there's a good case to be made by Maersk that it was the wrong decision. But if I were them, I would just bury the hatchet and say, okay, you go off and look after Durban, we'll go off and look after Cape Town. I know it's probably won't happen like that, but we can't actually hang around. The courts are going to take forever. to resolve this problem.
And then your coup de grace is that you're going to be pro-market, not pro-business.
Yeah, that's an interesting, possibly an interesting, ironic, paradoxical statement. But what that means is that by not being pro-business, we're not being pro-business individual businesses. We're not trying to pick winners. We're not trying to support particular sectors necessarily. We're wanting markets to operate in the way in which they were designed to not designed, but that's how it operates naturally. You know, the way in which people trade.
Yes.
That's how people do business together. And we have to make sure that the rules of the game are fair for everybody.
Yep.
Which they're not at the moment.
Yeah.
You know, creating a level playing field is absolutely vital. Definitely not something which the ANC has been doing in the past. They've definitely picked their favorites. So we need to try and allow markets to operate. As you said right at the beginning, as a business person, you just want government to get out of your face. So we've got to try and achieve that.
Yeah. I mean, I always use the example. Could you imagine if there was a minute, and I don't want to give anybody ideas. Please, if you're from the ANC, please don't watch this. But could you imagine if there was a ministry of fast food? That would mean that Ibrahim Patel would have to decide which fast food outlets to support and which ones not to support, and where they should operate and what their hours are.
No, and one of the things that we're going to be taking issue with is the Public Procurement Act. Because the Public Procurement Act requires the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition within 18 months to designate sectors and businesses that need to be given special treatment. And, you know, the economy is so complex. How does anybody pick a sector or a product range or something that needs to be given special treatment? I think that it's ill-conceived, and I think that this is one of the things that's going to be argued at length. And in fact, the DA is putting forward a bill soon, a private member's bill, to rethink the entire public procurement process.
When we talk about ill-conceived ideas, in closing, can we talk about whether the government of national unity is a good idea or an ill-conceived idea?
It's a good idea for a number of reasons. First of all, nobody won the election, so there has to be some sort of compromise, some sort of coalition. Some people would say that that's not necessary. We have what could be called a confidence and supply arrangement. In other words, the ANC is the biggest party, would just operate on a vote-by-vote basis, which theoretically is fine, but it does upset markets, and markets are important, particularly financial markets that provide us with the funding to keep the government going. And also our trading partners, they want stability. So if you assume that that's a coalition of some sort is the way to go, you then have to ask, well, coalition of whom? And if we didn't go into the coalition as the DA, none of the other smaller parties probably would have come along, because they all represent a fairly sort of collective mindset around the primacy of the Constitution, the need for open markets, the need for positive reform. But the other people, I'm talking about particularly the EFF and the MK party, don't want any of that. They would radicalize policy dramatically. In the case of MK, they would actually abolish the Constitution. They would bring back parliamentary sovereignty, which is what we had under the National Party. The EFF would nationalize everything under the sun. So we had a sort of existential choice as the DA as to which way do we go. And so I think it was the right decision, and we're going to be doing everything we can to keep it in place until 2029.
Do you think there's any chance that you might influence the ANC, or do you think at some point they're going to stop just doing what they're doing to you?
So we're the sort of battered child. I think that it's beginning to change. As I said earlier, I think they're realizing that they don't call all the shots, and that the alternative is just as bad for them as it is for us. So I'm hopeful that we will see each other.
And on the note of bad for them or bad for you, do you think that your joining the GNU has been good for the Democratic Alliance? Do you think you will see an increase at the polls because you've made this move?
We have seen an improvement in our ratings, our polling. We've seen that our voters are, on the whole, supportive of what we're doing. They see that we were facing an existential choice, and we made it very clear. When we had the grouping of parties, the multi-party charter, that we didn't win the election of the multi-party charter, so it was dissolved, understandably, and now we've got to think of something else to do, and that was what we did. So yeah, I'm hopeful that the trend is going to continue upwards.
Well, Toby, which is a good small business, and that is Pace Car Rental, and they're not so small anymore. So they help to keep us on the air, because none of those big companies that you get around the table would be brave enough to sponsor a show like this. That's just something to think about. They would definitely not do it, but Pace have done it, and our watchers and subscribers have been good in supporting Pace. You get a discount. Go to their website when you need to hire a car. You'll get a discount when you use the SONA code. And that's enough of a plug for that. But I would like to thank everybody that watched us today. To Toby Chance, thank you so much from the DA. Now that I've got your number, I'm going to get you here till they make you a minister, and then you'll stop taking my calls. But really, it's great to get that kind of insight from the DA. We really appreciate it. And to everybody that watched us today, thank you so much. We'll see you again on the State of the Nation. Thank you.